anyone have any questions or anything that they would like to talk about, even if it's just like general questions? Not so much. Okay,
I'm
that's okay.
speechless. Today I'm speechless.
That's all right. Some days it's just good to just rest your vocal cords, you know, and just lean back and just watch a good show. Okay, so tell you what, I will share my screen again, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about Git, and you guys can maybe tell me where you guys, if we come across something like how we do with, you know, how you guys are using Git and stuff. So let's see here. I'm trying to think of what I want to talk about first. So I'll just open up that repo, just going through there. So first of all, just kind of quick thumbs up, or kind of like you can just like nod or whatnot. Who's like started a repo for their capstone project? Cool. All right. So, you know, that's good. And that, I would say, like, if you haven't yet and you do have the data and you have your notebooks, do that, you know, as soon as you can. One thing, I've literally had someone not do this, and then they lost part of their work in the middle of working on their capstone. And thankfully they were able to reproduce most of it and stuff like that. But it was definitely like a very stressful and unnecessary part. You can imagine if something else happens that, like, you know, like losing all of your work would not be fun, you know, the day before the project or whatever. It's a good habit to have where you're doing commits. Like, you can see like, I mean, one, it's also like you're making a lot of commits. So you can make yourself look kind of good. Like, hey, look how frequently I'm actually doing stuff, you know, look at me being a data scientist and actually doing code. This is something like, it's definitely not the whole story. It's not something that's going to be like, I don't know, like someone looks at your things like, oh, I'm going to hire this person because they have a lot of green on their like GitHub repo. But it does kind of like give like one extra element where someone comes to your page and actually sees your GitHub. And you can really think about it in the sense that, like, the person who's coming across that, like a recruiter or hiring manager or whoever, what's going through, they're not going to spend a huge amount of time on your page, right? They're not going to like dive deep and like see all the different nuances and stuff. So you want to make it as easy as possible. So one thing you can do is, first of all, having frequent contributions, right, to your GitHub like repos. So that means frequent commits. And when I say frequent commits, it's like whenever you make a change that like has a logical change. Like, I'll usually do a commit when I have implemented some structure in there. And that structure could be like, oh, I made like one small change to my neural network, but it took off, you know, really well. Like, you know, maybe, for example, I changed, you know, the where it does early stopping, and say that's a huge option. Other times I might actually change a whole bunch of different things, and that might be my one logical change. And like the important part there is actually having, in that case, as much as possible, something like a description of like what you're doing in your commits. So your commits should ideally have, like, you know, if you see things like, you know, use script to clean log from information or from simulation. Like, the idea here is that I can look at these commits and more or less kind of know what they're doing, versus like saying, you know, like, oh, fix this, or, you know, new model. It's like, well, what's new about it? You know, like keeping that to kind of relatively concise, and it's a lot easier than to find different things. One thing I like to do that I learned from somewhere, I can't remember where it's from, but like sometimes I'll like to tag it, like essentially like put like feature or refact for refactoring, to kind of like signals like, oh, this is something I changed. Like, here's a new feature. Here's is a commit that is refactoring it. You'll see me do some things like, you know, error and fix and clean. So for example, like clean, for example, is like, oh, it's kind of like just adding some extra stuff. It doesn't really change the code too much, but I just wanted to make sure I specified, oh, I made this change in here. So the good thing is, like, if I make those changes, if I clean something up and I made a mistake for some reason, I can go back and see where I made that mistake. And so it's easier to trace back where I had mistakes and stuff like this. So this is essentially documenting your process. And then of course, like I think I mentioned, I don't have any commits on here, but I'll put like doc as being like, oh, here's some documentation, like you might read me, or, you know, like some information about what I'm doing. And again, it just makes your life a little bit easier when you do come to your, like, if you're wondering, like, you know, I do Git, but like, what's the point of it? The point then, so you can actually look at this and actually see what changes you've made. Do you guys know you can do this on GitHub? Like, you can go to all your commit history, and then like you can click on even your commit, and you can see specifically what you changed, what you added. In this case, I just added a bunch of stuff, but sometimes you actually see things like you'll remove things. So I can do a fix probably. So you can see here. Oh, well, okay. The biggest problem is model.ipnb is usually because it's so different. Like this is going to look ridiculous. Like you can see, the problem is a JSON format, which is the biggest issue using Git for Jupyter Notebooks. Is probably that you get all this stuff, but at least you can kind of get an idea of like what you've changed and things like that. Okay. So some advice is using your frequent commits. And on top of that, if you're doing it on your own repo, it'll show up on here. This is kind of why early on I said, like, you know, doing a fork, like you can do a fork, especially if you're like doing a fork. So you're going to merge into someone else's code or even your own code. Like let's say you're doing a new feature or you're doing a fix and you want to show, you know, like let's say you forked like, you know, this repo here and I had a mistake in here. You might fork it and then do a pull request, say, hey, I made this change because you made a mistake, or there's this new feature that I added in here. And you can basically do that. That's when you would do a fork. The thing about that though, is that when you do a fork, anything that you do on that fork does not show up on here as a contribution unless it's been merged into the main repo, not a fork. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is kind of the reason why, like I said, like if you're forking, like if you're doing your capstone, I wouldn't say, you know, or any other project, I would say, oh, don't fork the Flatirons like README, like that, the repo, and then do your work, because then it doesn't show that you're doing your own work. It looks as if like you're just doing something else to fix someone else's problem and never merge it, where it really is like, oh, you really are doing your own work. So that's kind of just be aware of that.
Another thing, when you use clone, because I always clone, I don't fork. When you use clone, are you better off like after you clone it, getting rid of the hidden Git file and then doing a new Git init so that it looks completely your own? Because if not, you get like there's somebody that contributed to the original making of these courses that appears once in your project as being, you know, as being a contributor.
Yeah, that's actually a real. Here, let me see if I can pull up a repo that I know that I had. So let's say, trying to think real quick. What would have that? I think this one I had. One of these two will have it. So this one, oh good. This is 135 commits. I will tell you right now, I didn't do all 135 of those commits. You can see, like, for example, this was like essentially a fork over. So when you do this, you want to make sure, like, if you want to keep this history, so one thing you could do is just make your own repo and just completely ignore, like, don't fork it, don't cloning it, or like Alvaro said, get rid of the .git and then make it your own repo. But if for some reason you did want to keep these commits, which sometimes, like, honestly, you frequently will want to do that, you can, let me see my commit where I get rid of some stuff. Let me just go to the beginning stuff because I know this is. Okay, so this is actually really convenient. So this is kind of like this repo that I originally had basically said, like, hey, what you can do is you can go ahead and do basically a git make this repo, git clone, but then the main thing you want to do is actually change this guy right here, is this remote. So this is where if you set your own remote, so this, usually people will clone it, and then it'll be like you try to do a git add, you know, git commit, git add, git commit, and then do a git push, and you get something like, oh, you can't push it or whatever. It's because of this guy right here. Basically, the remote that when you clone it, it's pointing to the original repo, which you probably don't have permission to write because it's someone else's repo. So you probably don't have permission to push there, and you don't want to push to that direction anyway. You want to push onto your own repo. So you want to make sure you do a git remote set URL origin, and then you would actually say the link to your repo specifically, essentially, like there. And that right there will allow you to then upload all your stuff. And in that case, you'll still get, you know, these commits in here, but it'll actually be under your repo. But yeah.
Yeah, I do. I always reset my my remote repo anyway.
Yeah, and you can do that. I would say as you guys get more into like working on teams and stuff like this, like you might want to consider keeping that history on there so you can kind of refer back to like what has been changed, even if it wasn't your specific one and you want to make your own repo from it. So the real easy thing to do is essentially just changing the remote. And that remote is like when you do like your git remote -v, which is this guy right here. If you do git remote -v, it will show you like, it will usually say origin if you're doing, usually if you're doing GitHub. So origin and then like the actual like link to your repo. So it looks something like, you know, like, well, that's not a repo. It looks something like this, you know, .git. So yeah. What's nice about that, if you think about that, you're like, huh, like this remote, it doesn't actually have to be GitHub. It can actually be other things too. For example, there's Bitbucket, which is also a Git repository, GitLab, but you can also do this if you're working in industry. You guys probably don't have to worry about this right now, but you can actually have a local remote computer and you can push it to a remote server. So for example, if the company has like a specific server that they're running and you want to like do a bunch of work and you want to push it to their central server, you can push to their central server onto that remote. I saw you unmute for a second. Yes.
Oh, I was going to say you can have, you know, an Altation server locally, Altation, I forget how you pronounce it. But yeah, all different Git variants that are used corporately rather than, you know, so only available through your company.
Yeah, and you honestly, this could even just be another computer. Like it doesn't even have to be something fancy. Like where I used to work full time, there was just essentially a central server that was a Linux computer, and essentially it was like instead of this like URL, it was literally a path, like a network path to a local computer on the network. So you might have something like that. So another thing you can do, we'll talk more about this maybe for dashboards. Have you guys heard of Heroku? Has anyone heard of that before? I see a couple nods. Yeah, if you haven't heard of Heroku, it basically allows you to like build, like, you know, web apps, cloud, like they talk about, what does it say? Cloud application program. Basically, if you built for like a dashboard, for example, but you want other people to access it, you can have that together. So for example, for me, I'm trying to make sure that I don't like expose something that I'm not like that's a little more private on the recording, but I think this is fine. So let's hear Rory and Corey. Let's see if this is right. Or is it Corey and Rory? I have both websites, but I can't remember.
They allow you to host a certain number of apps for free before you start paying, I think.
Exactly.
I think it's like 5 or somewhere between 5 and 10 apps that you're allowed.
It's pretty generous, yeah. It's I think you can do quite a lot. I can't remember specifically. I don't think it's specific how many apps. I think it's more like what extent are they using? And so, like for example, number of processes too. But I think you can have like many apps. They're just not necessarily running all at the same time. So like for example, the always on. So this is a great way, like if you want to do something like this one, I actually broke this on purpose. So you can't get this information. But for example, we'll talk maybe about Streamlit, which is really useful, like quickly, like I've recently found out about this. And it's a really great way to like quickly make dashboards without having to like worry about the full nuances of like trying to make this work. If you basically just want to have your project and you want to show it off real quick. What's nice is that you can actually have Heroku here. And the reason why I mentioned Heroku is because you can literally just push, like just how you do a git push to GitHub, you can do a git push to Heroku, and Heroku will automatically, you can set it up so Heroku will automatically say, oh, new code, let me load it up, and then people can actually visit that specific like web app on here, that dashboard or whatever you have. So that can be really useful too. So what I'm trying to get at is don't think of this Git remote as being only for GitHub. Like that can be whatever. Git is a tool that's beyond GitHub, though GitHub is kind of like usually where most people put their stuff. And honestly, I kind of recommend it. You know, there's some gripes about it and stuff like this, but the big thing is like it's a place where it's been for a long time where people have gone to share and collaborate and stuff like that. So it's got pretty good tools on that, and it's pretty common. So yeah, anyway, cool. I'm just kind of giving you guys an overview of like using GitHub versus like the technical bits of Git and everything like that. One recent thing that has happened, you can now put a little little page here, like that will show up when someone visits your site and stuff like that. So you'll see a lot of people start doing this now. And all you have to do is make a repo called, the name of your user. So if your username, in my case, is Mr. Geislinger, if I make a repo called Mr. Geislinger and just add a README, this guy right here is actually a special repository. So this will actually show up as your little, it's called, it'll show up right here on your page. So you can do little customization and stuff like that. And for example, you can put your resume here. You can put, your contact information on here. Or maybe you want to highlight a couple projects that you've had, for example, a capstone you've done. You might want to put something like that here, just to kind of get a quick summary where someone looks at this immediately and sees, oh, this is what this person's done, and they can see that. Okay. And you guys can probably figure things out. Editing your profile, so like adding something on there that like, you want to think of like, what would, if you're talking about for recruiters and hiring managers, what would make sure that describes you and that would catch their eye and that it is something that you want them to know. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So that's kind of like the overall structure of this stuff. But yeah, this thing again, like if you're ready to say, oh no, like I have a bunch of like, blank spaces here, what do I do? It's like, don't worry about it. Like, just kind of moving forward, just try to do your frequent commits, and do your pushes. And then even after graduating, right, after finishing your capstone, continue to do that, right? Continue to practice your code. If you're making a little thing, put in there. I mean, what's nice now is that GitHub even lets you have like your unlimited number of private repos for free. So if you want to, for example, you could have like a repo called Scratchwork, and you just use that for like maybe, every other day you do a little bit of practice of like data science stuff or even Python things or whatever you're doing, and you can push that too. And, one is going to get you used to using Git, right? So it's going to make you feel more familiar and more comfortable. And two is that it's going to kind of show a little bit that like, oh, you're active. This is kind of a direct source of like, oh, look, someone's been doing a lot of stuff. So yeah, cool. All right. You guys have any questions specifically, like you guys have run into Git or GitHub that you guys like me to talk about or anything like that? No, pretty good. Cool. All right. Hopefully you guys feeling pretty, like, how do you guys feel about Git, by the way? Like, you guys feel really comfortable with it? Or you're like, oh, I'm still learning a whole lot, or like, it's like, I try not to use it at all. Yeah, feeling pretty comfortable. Sideways, yeah. Some stuff to learn, maybe feel more comfortable. Yeah, this is where I would say like it does, like, there's a lot to Git. Like, I will tell you, you do not need to know everything about Git. I don't know everything about Git. I don't know, who knows? I don't think there's anyone I've ever come across who could actually say like, oh, they know like everything how to do with Git. There's so many little commands and stuff like that. And they're really useful, but like no one remembers it all. So I think the biggest thing is you guys know now how to push and stuff like this. The next thing, if you guys are kind of like, okay, like I feel really comfortable, like, how do I do this? Looking into Git branches, is branching is really helpful to like create new features, able to merge them together basically. So you can kind of work on two different projects. Like you can work on a variation of your project without having to like essentially like do a variation and then realize, oh shoot, that's not going to work. And then have to like essentially undo everything. You can essentially just abandon the branch, say, ah, never mind. Like, I'm not going to do this anymore. Or if you have a branch and you do something really cool, you can merge onto your main stuff and people say, oh, this is your main thing to go through. And typically with a lot of version control with like, working industry, you usually will have like a repo that everyone has access to. And there's a main branch, or, there used to be called master, but default's turning into main, is that the main branch. And then you have, your branch, your thing that you're working on, and you're working on that. And then what you'll do is to basically to merge your branch onto that main. We'll be doing something like a pull request. And sometimes only certain people with certain, like essentially like managers might only have access to the actually merging the pull requests. And the pull request basically is, hey, will you please pull my work onto the main branch or whatever branch you're asking to do a pull request on. So that's kind of what that looks like. I actually have a good example of that, I think I have it in the star. So, and what's kind of cool is that you can actually practice this now if you find like a repository that you find. So this person here made a owlet sock, or not owlet, there's this thing called an owlet sock, which is like a pulse oximeter for like babies, and you can put on their foot. My twins have this, right? So like they can kind of measure. I get to have all this data, which is fun. But the main thing is that it's meant for the app. So this person actually figured out how to kind of reverse engineer the protocol, right, for the API to work with there. So basically made up an API themselves. So actually like, this is really cool. But the problem is that it only worked for single babies because no one ever thought about having two babies at the same time and doing this. So in this case, I actually like changed a little bit. You can see a little bit my process. Like these are my commits. Allow multiple devices to be logged with twins, log device serial names. So kind of like doing these little bit things to like make sure it's obvious. And I made those changes. And then you can actually see in this case, I made a pull request and saying, okay, like, hey, I made these changes. This is kind of my fork of it. Like, if you want to use this, you know, like this is kind of my request to pull onto the main one. So again, I don't have access to this actual, like writing access to this repo, but the person who did have it, it's like, oh yeah, it looks good. So they went ahead and merged it onto there. And so it's kind of cool is that you can feel proud about yourself, like, oh, I made a contribution to, you know, the open source community or whatever it is. But it's also good practice for you guys too when you're working with teams. So yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's kind of, I don't know. Trying to think if there's anything I should really let you guys know. The other things you can, I always think about, like, I always like talk about stuff, and then even with other instructors, and I realize as we're talking, someone doesn't necessarily know this. So if you want to, you can actually edit stuff directly on GitHub. So you can do that. If you do this, however, like you can see, like you do a commit just like you normally would. If you do end up doing this, make sure on your machine, on your computer, you do a git pull of this data. Otherwise, we'll be out of sync and you might get a merge conflict. So just kind of be aware is that if you do changes on here, it's a good idea to do a git pull, because otherwise that your branches are going to be out of sync. And it's not a huge issue, but you could get something called a merge conflict, which again can be solvable, but then it's just more of a pain, where if you just did a git pull, you're fine. Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't know. You guys have any other questions? We have like 5 more minutes. Get it or otherwise. No, not so much. Yeah, yeah, I would say like some good etiquette for Git is, you know, especially if it's open source, like it's available for you to see, you know, just kind of being aware of like what you can put in there. If you like repo, like you can star it, like, which is kind of like, I don't know, I think it's kind of funny. Like I'm not a big person like doing the like thing and stuff like this, but like you can give like a repo a star, which also kind of bookmarks it, which is how I use it. And if you do come across like certain things, so for example, let's say I do like scikit-learn, which is open source. Oops, not in my user. It says all GitHub commit. Oh, that's confusing. Scikit-learn, all GitHub. You can actually, oh, there it is. I should have paid attention. So you can actually take this guy, and let's say you find an issue, you can actually open up an issue directly on, like, you know, here's like, hey, like, you know, there's actual issue on this, which has happened to me a few times before, even with like really well like documented and like things work well. For example, I think it was TensorFlow, or maybe it was Keras. There's this issue with this. Basically, it's like if you did image data generation, it only works for classification. It doesn't work for any what's called regression problems. So, you know, for example, this person, you know, put in great details, like you know, like oh, hey, this is the issue I had. And then like when I did my commit, which is what I was doing, I actually went ahead and tagged it, and it automatically, like you can actually see like, oh, like documented this issue. This is already existing. I actually put this link in here on my commit. So let's go to, let's see if I can go to this commit. There we go. If I go to this commit, you can actually see it's like, hey, I made this commit here and actually put in that documentation. And what's nice about that is that GitHub actually automatically says, oh, that's a link to an actual issue, and it'll actually add that issue on here. So what's nice is that now I'm watching this issue, so if this ever changes or gets closed or whatever, I can actually say, hey, like, oh, good, they updated this, I can fix my thing. Or you can also, if they're on this end, they say, hey, there's a bunch of people who have this issue. This should be something that gets fixed too. And this is, again, like, you know, it's kind of useful for you because then you kind of organize your own stuff, but also like in the sense of like the kind of the meta side, like it also shows a little bit like if someone goes to your profile like and just sees these kind of things that you're doing, you know, in passing, like it kind of adds a little bit of credibility. It's like, oh, this person is like using, it's not just using Git just to put, you know, a check mark. It's like, oh, he knows how to use Git, or she knows how to use Git, or whatever. It's going to be like, oh, they actually are participating on this platform. So yeah, that's where like, people will say like, oh, should I put down, Kaggle and GitHub and GitLab and whatever? And I'm like, yeah, but only if you use it. Like, don't put it down if it's like you made a Kaggle profile and like haven't done much on it. Like, you can still have it, like, right? But like, I would say be careful about what you put on your resume, because you want everything that person goes off of your LinkedIn profile, your resume, to be something that they find substance, right? They're like, oh, this is what they've done. So yeah, cool. So anyway, that was kind of a little bit of advice for a little bit of job search too, and stuff like that. Because again, you just want to make it easy for someone to be convinced that like, oh yes, this is someone I want to talk with. Because in a lot of ways, all of this stuff is really just to get you to the next step, which is really interviewing. And that's when they're really going to like essentially make their decision. Like, people aren't typically making their decision like after interviewing and then looking at your GitHub profile and seeing like, oh, like, like they made so many contributions this year. Usually it's going to be more like, oh, like, hey, this application came in, like, what does this look like? Oh, it looks like this person's actually pretty active. Okay, like this person might be worth interviewing. Okay, cool. All right. Well, yeah, I can stop it here unless you guys have any follow-up questions. And we have like, it's about like the last minute. All right, so I'll stop recording.